And what I want to speak about today is a statement of the obvious that the media sector, particularly print media, is facing some extraordinary challenges. So I want to start with the uncontroversial proposition. I think that yours is an industry in flux. I want to argue that this raises some pretty novel and important public policy questions, and I want to talk about some of the responses to those questions you're seeing and starting to see from government here in Australia and from governments around the world. So if we start with the proposition that yours is an industry in flux, that follows, of course, nearly 2 centuries in which newspaper businesses were amongst the most lucrative and powerful in the land. The Sydney Morning Herald goes back to 1831, the West Australian goes back to 1833, and many newspaper proprietors built vast fortunes. It's quite instructive if you go onto the Trove website, maintained by the National Library of Australia, which sits within the art side of my portfolio, digitised copies of newspapers going back for many, many years, and it's a fantastic resource. And if you look at the Sydney Morning Herald of 16 January 1890, what you see is that the majority of the first page is advertisements, many of them from shipping lines. William Howard Smith and Sons advertising their line of magnificent fast steel steamships, one of which was departing for Melbourne and Adelaide on Friday the 17th of January, so the day after this particular edition came out. Also featuring prominently on the first page are personal notices. And Mr. Jesman, for example, advertises, quotes, "CBK, come home at once and all will be forgiven, all broken-hearted." You have to get to page 4 of the 12-page edition before you come across any actual news. When newspapers were effectively the only way of distributing information quickly to large numbers of people, they were in a very strong economic position. Famously, of course, the classifieds were called the rivers of gold, and I think it's no accident that still today the newspapers in Geelong and Adelaide are called the Advertiser. That powerful position continued for a very long time. Even as radio and then television came along, classified advertising continued to be highly profitable for newspapers that had strong market shares. It took the arrival of the internet to disrupt the newspaper business in Australia and around the world. And in some ways, it's the same story as in many other sectors, as businesses with decades or even centuries of dominance, like Kodak, Encyclopaedia Britannica or Barnes & Noble, found their product no longer competitive with internet-delivered alternatives. But there's a particular twist to the way the internet has affected the newspaper business, as the ACCC's recent digital platforms review explains. The traditional newspaper business is an example of what economists call a two-sided market. Newspapers provide 2 services: advertising, particularly classified advertising, and news. Classified advertising historically made lots of money. News generally did not, although it did give people a reason to buy the newspaper, and it was cross-subsidised by the profits from advertising. Of course, the internet comprehensively disrupted classified ads because it delivered a better solution both for advertisers and for those wanting to purchase. We've seen this just in Australia with the success of carsales.com.au, seek.com.au, domain.com.au, realestate.com.au, and of course, when it comes to personal ads, poor old Mr. Jesman of January 1890 today presumably would be on Facebook or even Tinder. So this disruption happened very quickly, as the ACCC's Digital Platforms Review documents. In 1998, nearly 60% of advertising spend in Australia went to print media. Just 20 years later, this had fallen to around 11%. Across the same period, online advertising grew from virtually nothing in 1998 to contribute over half of the total advertising spend 20 years later in 2018. So as everybody in this room knows only too well, declining advertising revenue has put newspapers in significant distress, despite strenuous attempts to adapt to the digital environment. Since 2012, online subscriptions have only offset 53% of the loss in print sales, and online advertising has only offset 13% of the loss in print advertising. Now, while the internet offered a better solution than classified advertising, what it did not offer, in the main, was a better way to deliver journalism. That still requires journalists using their skills and investigative capacity to sniff out good stories, to find sources, to write a good yarn. It takes hard, sustained, repeated work. It needs editorial judgment and feedback from peers and from supervisors. It needs to be polished through sub-editing. It needs to be legal. It needs all of the other quality control processes of a newsroom. We hear a lot about citizen journalism, and certainly it's rare today that a newsworthy event is not captured in a photo or a video taken by a smartphone-wielding bystander. But unsurprisingly, most quality print journalism still comes from people employed in traditional newsrooms. What is very clear, though, is that the number of such traditional newsrooms and the number of people employed in them is declining. And again, the statistics cited by the ACCC, based on data provided by the main employers in your industry, are telling. There was a 20% decline in the number of journalists in traditional print media businesses between 2014 and 2018. And the ACCC data also shows 106 local and regional newspaper titles closed across Australia between 2008 and 2018, a net 15% decrease in the number of these publications. Which brings me to the public policy implications of these changes. Of course, any time an existing industry has falling profits and jobs being cut, that is a public policy issue. But the importance of journalism in our society and in our economy goes well beyond simply profits and jobs. Again, as the ACCC noted in its digital platforms inquiry, the social benefits of journalism include holding the powerful to account, campaigning for social goals, keeping a journal of record, and providing a forum for ideas. Hence, if there's less journalism, that's a problem. It's also important to be clear about where the impact is being felt most. I mentioned the number of local and regional titles which have closed. The ACCC's analysis shows that these closures have left 21 local government areas, including 16 in regional Australia, without coverage from a single local newspaper in either print or online formats. A similar issue has been highlighted in the UK in the Cairncross Review into a Sustainable Future for Journalism, which reported earlier this year. And the author, Dame Frances Cairncross, drew attention to a couple of specific issues. Quote, "Two areas of public interest news matter greatly. Each is often of limited interest to the public, but both are essential in a healthy democracy. One is investigative and campaigning journalism, and especially investigations into abuses of power in both the public and private sphere. Such journalism is particularly high cost and high risk. The second is the humdrum task of reporting on the daily activities of public institutions, particularly those at local level, such as the discussions of local councils or the proceedings in a local magistrate's court." Now, governments have historically not given these issues much attention, precisely because until recently, the robust financial health of the print media sector has underpinned the delivery of much public interest journalism. Of course, there's long been a policy in Australia and in a number of other countries to fund a national broadcasting corporation, or indeed two if you include SBS. And there are some limited local news requirements for regional television broadcasters. But when it comes to jobs done traditionally by the print media, these have tended to occur independently of policy or regulatory intervention. Quite apart from the media policy questions triggered by the disruption of traditional media businesses, there are also important competition policy questions which go to the operation of markets in which advertising services are sold. The questions of whether global giants like Facebook and Google have substantial market power and whether they're misusing that market power. And indeed, it was the importance of these competition issues which led our Liberal National Government to assign to the ACCC, our competition regulator, the task of having a look at the impact of the digital platforms on the media sector. The public policy importance of Google and Facebook and their impact on the media sector therefore arises firstly because of the competition issues, but it's amplified by the fact that the businesses which are being affected are also providers of a public good, namely journalism. When Google has 19.2 million Australians who use it every month, Facebook 17.3 million, these companies are having a massive impact on the lives of Australians. And when we think about what they do and what their competitors, such as traditional Australian media businesses, do, it clearly raises another important issue as well, which is questions of Australia's cultural identity. That's been an important consideration in many aspects of media policy over the years. For example, through the requirement that free-to-air television licensees need to show a certain amount of Australian content. Now, I've argued that there are some significant and indeed unprecedented threats to Australian journalism arising out of the dominance of the global digital platforms. I want to also touch on an issue which I know many in your sector are concerned about, the implications of the Australian Federal Police in June this year executing search warrants against the ABC and against News Corp journalist Anarchist Medhurst. Let me make the point that unlike the challenge from global internet giants, the AFP's actions are not unprecedented. In a parliamentary democracy, there will always be, there's long been, a healthy tension between competing objectives. Press freedom, of course, is a bedrock of democracy, but there's never been an absolute freedom to publish. It's always been subject to constraints such as defamation law, designed to protect the reputation of citizens against unjustified attack, the law of sub judice, designed to protect the right of an accused to a free and fair trial, and to national security considerations, recognising that there are matters known to government which, if released into the public domain, would put the lives of Australians in danger. The government certainly acknowledges that following the execution of these search warrants, there is concern amongst working journalists. We've taken a number of steps in response. The Attorney-General asked the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security to conduct an inquiry into the impact of the exercise of law enforcement and intelligence powers on the freedom of the press. And there's also a Senate Environment and Communications References Committee, and the government will carefully consider the reports of both committees after they've been tabled. The Minister of Home Affairs has also acted, issuing a ministerial direction to the Australian Federal Police, which makes clear the government's expectation that the AFP take into account the importance of a free and open press in Australia's democratic society, including exhausting alternative actions before undertaking investigative action involving a journalist. And I'd also point out that several laws passed in recent years contain specific protections for journalists. Well, I've spoken about the challenges to journalism and the public policy issues this raises. Let me turn in the last part of my remarks to some of the responses that you're seeing from governments and from others in Australia and around the world. Can I start by observing that in the last Parliament, under then Prime Minister Turnbull and then Communications Minister Mitch Fifield, we saw the most significant changes in media regulation for 30 years, with the abolition of outdated rules concerning cross-media ownership. The intention was to allow existing players facing unprecedented competition from internet-based businesses to come together to build scale, improve their economics, and in turn become better placed to respond to such competition. That regulatory change has allowed the acquisition of the Fairfax newspaper business by Nine, and I've certainly been struck in my initial meetings with the Nine management team by the vigour with which they're tackling the challenges facing the former Fairfax newspapers. And of course, last month, Nine released its financial results showing net profit after tax up 12% on the previous corresponding period, and a 56% growth in digital and publishing EBITDA, underpinned by more than 60% growth in both Metro Media and Nine Now. Now, another outcome of that cross-media reform process that our Liberal National Government initiated was our commitment to commissioning the ACCC to conduct a review about the importance of the digital platforms and their impact on competition in the Australian media industry and in advertising services markets. And that work was finally reported on after some 18 months earlier this year. There'd been 180 public submissions, around 60 statutory notices issued by the ACCC for the production of documents. The final report is a very, very substantial 600-page analysis of the issues, which is going to be very influential in Australia, and I think it'll be influential around the world. The report points out the way that digital platforms have fundamentally changed how we produce, distribute and consume media content. Makes the point that the internet gives news media businesses opportunities to innovate, to reach new audiences and to do so with lower distribution costs. But there's also some more confronting news that Australia's current media regulatory framework has struggled to keep pace with changes in technology, consumer preferences and the way in which media businesses now operate. Traditional media businesses can face very detailed regulation while competing with digital platforms which largely go unregulated in Australia. And perhaps the greatest paradox is that digital platforms are both rivals to and increasingly essential business partners of news media businesses in the supply of advertising and dissemination opportunities. The ACCC makes 23 recommendations in response to the substantial market power that has arisen through the growth of the digital platforms. Now, the government recognises that news and journalism is an important public good. We accept the ACCC's overriding conclusion that there's a need for reform to better protect consumers, improve transparency, recognise power imbalances and ensure that substantial market power is not used to lessen competition in media and advertising services markets. And we also accept that there's a need to develop a harmonised media regulatory framework, as the ACCC has recommended. We've, as you know, asked for formal submissions from stakeholders to get the widest possible range of views on what the ACCC has recommended. We've had a lot of them, some of them still coming in, and we're reading them with great care ahead of a cabinet decision process later in the year and a formal response from government to the ACCC's recommendations before the end of the year. Let me touch on one particular recommendation, that there should be a targeted grants program that supports the production of original, local and regional journalism, including that related to local government and local courts. Our Liberal National Government has already committed substantial financial support, some $60 million over 3 years, through our Regional and Small Publishers Jobs and Innovation Package. Effectively, though, the ACCC is arguing that this should be replaced with a new grants program which it advocates. Now, some similar measures have been implemented in the UK, in Canada, in New Zealand, and a few weeks ago in New Zealand I had the chance to meet Jane Wrightson, the Chief Executive of New Zealand On Air, which administers grants programs under which journalists are located in particular regional towns, and the content they produce is available to local newspapers, radio stations and others. There have been some tricky issues in rolling out the program. For example, if journalists are funded in towns where there remains a viable local newspaper, government is effectively subsidising competitors to the business which already serves the town. Another issue is finding somewhere for the journalists to work so they're not isolated, and typically they're located in a Radio New Zealand newsroom even though they're independent of Radio New Zealand. In Britain, a similar scheme works through the BBC, with journalists employed by the BBC but their content available to local media outlets. These would all be the kinds of issues of detail we'd need to think about if Cabinet were to decide to take up this recommendation. Another issue, in my view, is whether such a program could be set up to provide opportunities for philanthropic support so as to leverage and extend the impact of any government spending. In the US, it's not uncommon for newspapers to receive support from philanthropic foundations. I'd like to acknowledge here the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas, and I applaud the commitment from Judith Neilson announced last year to support and celebrate quality journalism during this period of historic transformation. I was interested recently to see the Institute's director Mark Ryan, who I know is speaking here a bit later today, speak about how we might better coordinate work being done by industry and good things going on within and supported by government. Let me also mention that our funding for the ABC and Sbs is another important means of supporting quality journalism in the face of the current challenges. The ABC has some 56 outlets around Australia, so it makes an important contribution to local and regional journalism. And in the most recent budget, we committed an additional $43.7 million over 3 years to the ABC, bolstering its funding for regional and outer suburban news gathering, national reporting teams and state-based digital news. Well, let me conclude then by returning to my central point. Vibrant, vigorous, even rambunctious journalism has been vital to healthy democracies for centuries. A popular quote comes to mind, often attributed to the American press baron William Randolph Hearst. News is something somebody doesn't want printed. All else is advertising. We politicians don't always like what journalists produce. Shocking revelation, I know. Nor do officials. But it matters greatly for our democracy. Ultimately, whether journalism survives and prospers would depend a great deal more on the people in this room and on other newspaper and media managers than on what government may or may not do. Fundamentally, I'm an optimist. The newspaper industry found a sustainable competitive position after the arrival of radio, after the arrival of television, and I believe you will do the same in the post-internet world. It's important for your industry, it's important for democracy, it's important for a civilised society. So the kinds of issues you're discussing today at this conference are of great importance. Good luck in your deliberations today and in the decisions you will make in the coming days, months and years. Thank you.